Welcome to Code Mantra's Accessibility Insight interview series. I'm Barry Bealer, Senior Vice President of Strategic Alliances at Code Mantra, and your host for today's session. We are here speaking with Bill Kasdorf, who is an independent consultant in the publishing industry and widely seen as an accessibility expert. Bill is active in the W3C as the W3C Global Publishing Evangelist and serving on the Publishing Working Group, Publishing Business Group, and the epub 3 community group. And he also, in his spare time, co-chairs the NISO's Video and Audio Metadata Guidelines Working Group. Joining Bill is my colleague, Ian Smith, who is our Director of Accessibility Platforms and Solutions at Code Mantra. Ian has been a technologist all of his career and more recently architected Code Mantra's document accessibility remediation platform called Accessibility Insight. He is a frequent speaker at accessibility trade events and writes about accessibility issues and topics on our company blog. Thank you both for joining me today. The first topic I want to talk about is around accessibility landscape and the regulations in the landscape today. And Bill, let's start with you. I mean, can you give us kind of the lay of the land overall, what the universe of compliance and what the universe of standards looks like around accessibility?
Sure. It's really been a massive change over the past couple of years because accessibility standards have all coalesced around web standards. So in the old days, you had to have specialized formats for accessibility. And now web accessibility, ebook accessibility, which is epub 3 is the proper format for interchange of publication content. System accessibility are all based on web standards. And as a result, a lot of the kind of international requirements like Section 508 in the US, the EU, the UK, et cetera, have all kind of aligned along this. So the standards globally are much more alike, and the standards that for the systems and publications are really technologies that people already use anyway.
And Ian, given the work Code Mantra has done with global publishers to remediate publications, have publishers been aware of this standards landscape? And can you talk a little bit about what's required to make their books and journals and other documents compliant?
Yeah, absolutely, Barry. So yeah, I do believe many of them are aware of the standards, and the majority have taken action towards achieving those compliance requirements, doing so by partnering with experts that are familiar with the standards themselves. The actions that the publishers have taken vary in depth and breadth, though. Some have taken a holistic approach by implementing policies which do ensure new publications produced are accessible. And then there are others that are still working towards such a strategy of full compliance, and therefore they're required to remediate existing publications on an as-needed basis. Again, they're meeting their compliance requirements while they're trying to define a strategy to produce content in an accessible fashion. Both of these achieve the compliance goal in the end, but I think certainly the former is the more proactive and therefore will achieve results more efficiently over time.
Ian, from an assistive technology perspective, does a publisher need to be aware of the different assistive technologies on the market? And if so, is there anything in the remediation process that needs to be addressed in order to deliver appropriate content that is usable?
Yeah, absolutely, Barry. So knowledge of the different assistive technologies is definitely important. I would say equally, if not more so, though, is to understand how users of assistive technologies actually use them. Many, I think, believe that assistive technologies just read the content or the alternative text that's present. However, let's think a moment about how we consume content. Most of us, unless we're reading a novel for leisure, are seeking specific bits of information. The only way we achieve that is through the use of navigation. We skim a publication for the various parts and sections or headings until we actually find the portion of the publication that contains that information. Users of assistive technologies are no different. They also need to be able to skim, navigate, and traverse the sections of the document. So Therefore, an important aspect is truly a well-defined structure and other navigational elements that aid them in those abilities.
So given the need for all publishers to make the publications accessible, Bill, can you explain who at the publishers even think about the consumption of the publisher's content and when assistive technology comes into the conversation?
Pretty much it doesn't, just to be honest. But people are increasingly thinking about this. Ian's points were exactly spot on. And one saving grace is that the way that you communicate that structure and enable that kind of navigation he was talking about is not some kind of specialized markup, but it's standard HTML markup. This is mainly focusing on epub 3. Same thing for PDF, but it's not quite as systematic in PDF. But for EPUBs, using good HTML markup, using it properly, using what's called ARIA markup, assistive technology is actually programmed to use those things. So for example, there's ARIA roles. You can't make up a role. You have to use one of the already defined roles because that's what assistive technology uses. And I see in my work all the time, because I do a lot of accessibility reviews for people, and it's like they make up terms and it's totally useless. So the publisher needs to understand that.
So gentlemen, I want to talk a little bit about print-ready PDF versus EPUB 3 versus other file formats. And many times, as both of you know, publishers have to publish in these multiple formats. So given our topic around accessibility today, can both of you provide some guidance on the issues or opportunities with publishing to publish to print-ready PDF to EPUB 3 versus other file formats? So Bill, let's start with you.
First of all, publishers do need to produce all of these formats, particularly PDFs and EPUBs, totally common. The EPUBs are inherently more able to be made accessible because they reflow, you can change fonts, you can change sizes, you can change colors and contrast, etc. But in both cases, you need to get the structure right. You need to enable a person using assistive technology to walk through the content. For PDFs, that's most often done by remediation of the standard print-ready PDF that's come out in the publishing process. Whereas for EPUBs, increasingly, more of that accessibility functionality is getting built into the workflow so that it's there in the first place. So most PDFs being created today are not very accessible, but they can be made more accessible. Mm-hmm. A lot of EPUBs, in many cases, can be what's called born accessible. They're just accessible right out of the gate.
Great. How about you, Ian?
Yeah, no, I echo a lot of what Bill said. He's right in the fact that EPUB by nature is natively, almost accessible or can be fully accessible, and therefore it's easier to be, spruced up, if you will, to be fully compliant. PDF has been and will likely always remain a challenge. I do believe that there's processes being developed and tools to be utilized that make them more accessible than they have in the past as a matter of creation, but they can also be made highly accessible as well. And publishers, Bill mentioned also that they're required to produce for both formats in a lot of cases. They have different channels that are maybe only accepting certain formats. So they are in a position to where both formats will likely need to be made accessible.
So gentlemen, let's talk a little bit about born accessible versus publication remediation at the end of the publication process. So it appears that some publishers have adopted this born accessible workflow while others are in a more traditional workflow where they remediate the PDF post-processing. Can both of you provide some pros and cons of each approach and describe if you see a trend in one direction or the other as far as adoption? So Ian, let's start with you on this one.
Sure. As you said, Barry, I think some have taken a holistic approach by implementing certain policies which ensure their new publications are produced accessible. There are certainly still others that are working towards such a strategy, and they're required, therefore, to remediate existing pubs on an as-needed basis. Both of these achieve the compliance result in the end, but the pro of the born accessible approach is it's going to be the most efficient over time. Maybe requires some heavy thought and reworking of processes at the beginning, but again, in the end, they're going to have a much more efficient workflow that saves them cost and time over the long term. Those that are still, I consider remediation a reactive approach. There's sometimes impediments that really keep them from being able to achieve a born state, but certainly that's the approach to go, making them accessible from the beginning versus the remediation.
How about you, Bill? What have you been seeing?
Well, actually, I think I'd like to make two comments about this that are relevant. One is that accessibility is not a binary thing, and workflows are not binary things. And what I mean by that is different users with different print disabilities often need different kinds of files and different kinds of remediation to be done on those files to work for their use. So for example, I do a lot of work with people that work in the disability services offices at universities. And even though, yes, EPUB is inherently more accessible, many users are using technology like a Kurzweil that currently doesn't use EPUB as well as it uses PDF. So those users want that PDF. And the other thing about the workflows not being binary is that those are not two separate workflows. But if you get your workflow right for EPUB, where you've got good structural markup, et cetera, it's much easier to get that navigation and structure into your PDF than if if it's the Wild West. So even when remediation is still going to be required, as Ian points out, getting a good workflow that's moving at least toward born accessible really pays off.
So since this is the last segment, I thought we would get into some best practices. And Ian, with your experience designing and building accessibility solutions, can you provide your top 3 recommended best practices for publishers in order for their publications to be accessible?
Absolutely, Barry. The first one I'd like to articulate is I think publishers should design with accessibility in mind. There are many publications that have been, had a long life that might be visually appealing and maybe true pieces of art in the print era, but in today's digital and accessible world, the ability to consume content in a variety of ways is much more important. Not to say that design's not either, but there are things that can be done with a design that help enable users to consume the content rather than impede them from being able to do so. So that's point one. Second, as we've talked throughout this series, is the use of EPUB for your primary accessible format. It is indeed probably the leader in the publishing space as far as an accessible format. So the use of it as your primary. Obviously, PDF can still be used and must be used in some cases. Third is ensuring technical compliance through the use of some known and trusted validation tools, one of which is the likes of Daisy's ACE checker for EPUB. So those will be my top 3, Barry.
And Bill, how about your top 3?
In addition to Ian's, which are all top 3s as well, number 1, your vendor is your partner. Partner with your vendors, because for most publishers, the vendors that are actually creating their publications, doing the technical work, know more than you do about how to do this right. So partner with them and keep a dialogue going. Number 2, just get the markup right. All these features in your publications are getting marked up. That's how you publish them, right? So it's not that you have to mark up something you didn't have to mark up before. Just mark it up according to the standards. That's really fundamental. So those first two are dead simple, easy to do. The third one is the challenge. You really need to address the issue of image descriptions, because really fundamentally that's the publisher's responsibility. Maybe you've got a vendor partner that's skilled at doing that. That's great, but you need to take responsibility to make sure that gets done, because almost always that's the big missing piece.
Thank you both for participating in our inaugural Accessibility Insight interview series. We appreciate the expert advice on the accessibility topics and hope that our publishing viewers are able to take away some key points and guidance on how to best implement accessibility into their publishing organization today. Please follow us on our YouTube channel and other social media channels. And for more information about codemantra and our accessibility solutions, you can visit www.codemantra.com. Thank you.